I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. If you share my concerns, then maybe you could like this video, subscribe to this channel, and maybe even click the little bell that will notify you when I post new videos, because I do try to post pretty frequently. So today, I want to talk about voting rights legislation and some important news that I read today that really, I think, escaped attention of most people. So I really want to bring attention to it. And maybe we can make some noise to raise this issue a little bit more. What it has to do with is the progress of the For the People Act, which is obviously the critical bill that has been stalled in Congress as a result of the opposition of Joe Manchin, who said he will not support it unless it's bipartisan legislation. Well, that announcement made most progressives and liberals kind of throw up our hands and say, oh my God, well, we're done now. And that is actually reflected in a new poll that came out that was just released today by Monmouth University. And as usual, I'm going to post links to all the articles on this information down below. And what this poll showed is a big decline in support for both Joe Biden and for Congress. And the big group among whom the drop occurred was Democrats. So for example, among Democrats, we're back in April, right after the COVID relief legislation was passed and where the infrastructure bill seemed to be making progress, 83% of Democrats said that we appeared to be on the right track. Now, that measure has fallen to just 59%. So what is that telling us? That's telling us that Democrats are frustrated. We were thrilled to see the early progress that Joe Biden was making, but now Biden and the Democrats in Congress need to put their money where their mouth is and get stuff done. We cannot be simply sitting around twiddling our thumbs while the Republicans do everything they can to destroy progress and actually reverse progress in state after state. So I can sympathize with that frustration. In fact, a little while back, I wrote an article on Medium, which I'll also post a link to, that described the fact that Democrats are saying we need Joe Biden to stop resting on his laurels. We need him to move forward and get more stuff done. That the initial COVID legislation was great, that the efforts to distribute vaccines were great, but more needs to be done. We cannot simply now say, oh, great, the job is done, we can move on. No, and one of the central issues that needs to be addressed, obviously, is the attack on voting rights that's occurring at the state level across the board, and the response to that is the For the People Act. Well, the big news today, which was only mentioned practically as a footnote in an Ezra Klein article in the New York Times today, is that Joe Manchin circulated a memo that described a compromise bill that he could support that would address many of these issues on voting rights. Some of the things that this compromise would include, according to the Klein article and another article in the New York Times, include a ban on partisan gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, of course, is where essentially elected officials will draw their own legislative districts in a way that will enable a party to win more seats than really it should win based upon the percentage of votes that it gets across the state. So that would be banned under this proposal by Manchin. He would restore key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. You have to remember, the Voting Rights Act was gutted by a U.S. Supreme Court decision a couple years ago, and this has been a priority of Democrats to be able to stop the attack on voting rights in the states, and that would be something that the Manchin deal would propose. He would make Election Day a public holiday, so no longer would people have trouble getting to the polls on Election Day. He would support early and mail-in voting with requirements that they be made accessible to people. It wouldn't be quite as expansive as Democrats are calling for, but still a big improvement over what is currently required. He would implement automatic voter registration nationwide. Those are huge accomplishments, and this bill, if it were passed according to the terms that Joe Manchin is proposing, would be the most significant voting rights legislation passed since the Voting Rights Act was passed in the 1960s. So what are the compromises that Joe Manchin is proposing as part of this compromise bipartisan deal? Well, what he includes in this bill is a requirement that voters would have to show certain forms of ID when they vote. That's a Republican priority. That's something, frankly, that we progressives have a weak argument against, at least weaker than some of the other provisions, because most people do have ID and most people don't see necessarily anything wrong with showing it to vote. It's probably not a huge thing to give up as long as some sort of escape hatch exists. And by escape hatch, I mean that on Election Day, voters could cast a provisional ballot or of some kind, something that could be counted once their identity is validated, perhaps after Election Day. So if that's what it takes to get Joe Manchin on board, well, let's take it. And another compromise that Manchin includes in his draft, dropping the campaign finance provisions that the Democrats have in the For the People Act. Well, the truth of the matter is there are some issues with the campaign finance reform provisions of this bill. For example, the Supreme Court might say none of it is lawful. to start with. Under the case Buckley v. Vallejo, an early 1970s case at the Supreme Court, which was the original Supreme Court decision addressing campaign finance reform, the court said that money, because of its importance in spreading information throughout the country in America, money is tantamount to speech. And as a result, limiting money in some way is a violation of the First Amendment. And that doctrine is really what has stood in the way of being able to pass comprehensive campaign finance reform legislation for years now. And in fact, the logic of Citizens United specifically cites that case and argues that part of the reason that corporations can spend money however they want is, number one, the Supreme Court had ruled previously that corporations are people under the law. And secondly, if people's speech is protected under the First Amendment, then the speech of corporations is protected. And thirdly, that if money is tantamount to speech, then we cannot limit the spending of money by corporations because that would violate their First Amendment provision. See the logic there? I don't agree with it, but that's the law, like it or not. And the Supreme Court, given its rightward tilt in recent years, is unlikely to overrule that, and frankly, is probably likely to use that as a basis to overturn any campaign finance provisions that are included in the legislation that passes. What's more is there are other ways for us to address the biggest issues in campaign finance reform legislation. And this was something else that was a very small, virtually unnoticed piece in the news that came out today. And this was in the Popular Information newsletter from Judd Legum. And I will also post a link to that newsletter below. What Legum talks about in his newsletter is that corporations are able to spend not only unlimited amounts of money on campaign finance, but they don't have to disclose any of it. And in fact, where shareholders have voted to require the boards to disclose campaign finance spending, most of these votes under the law are nothing more than advisory, and as a result are more than likely to be completely ignored by the board, as has happened in the past. Now, dating back to 2011, according to Legum, there was a proposal at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, that would require businesses to disclose the funding that they put into campaign finance. That's a pretty minimal requirement. And frankly, it's something that Justice John Roberts proposed in his opinion in Citizens United. He said that even though we can't ban the spending of money, more disclosure as to who's spending what where is the solution to this. And yet the SEC, after originally considering this back in 2011, during the Obama administration, by the way, ended up blocking it. And subsequently in 2015, when the Republicans took back control of Congress, they passed legislation that would bar the SEC from implementing a law like this. Imagine that. Basically, Congress passed a law that said that the Securities and Exchange Commission cannot require businesses to tell their shareholders how they're spending their money. Because let's be clear about this. When businesses spend money, they're spending the shareholders' money. And the shareholders, under current law, can't even find out how that money is being spent. And if they object to it being spent a certain way, their opinion is only advisory. Now, Judd Legum pointed out that there's currently legislation pending in Congress proposed by Democratic Congressman Andy Levin, my congressman, as it turns out. And what this legislation would do is it would undo that ban that Republicans put in place that stops the SEC from passing such a rule. Now, that's all well and good, and I support this legislation, but they can go farther than this. Just because the SEC is the one who can pass a rule requiring greater disclosure of campaign finance doesn't mean that they're the only ones who can do it. In fact, they are subject to the laws that Congress passes. So rather than Andy Levin's law, which could pass Congress, which would simply allow the SEC to move forward and require greater disclosure, we could pass a law through Congress that would actually mandate corporate disclosure itself, that would no longer need the SEC to step in and create a rule. Oftentimes when these agencies create these rules, it's because of the fact that Congress is unable to act. Well, if Congress is able to pass Andy Levin's proposed legislation, then certainly they could pass a broader law, which actually would simply take the decision off the table of the SEC and require that publicly traded corporations fully disclose their spending on political activities. And I would argue that the law should even take another step, and it should require that when shareholders, when they take these votes objecting to the spending of the business on certain types of activities, that these votes are not simply advisory. Again, this money that the business is spending belongs to the shareholders. The shareholders, you have to remember, are the owners of the business. So the owners of the business can't even tell the people who are running the business how to spend their money. So what we could do is include in this provision not simply a provision requiring that the business disclose its political spending, but that when shareholders take votes banning the spending of business money on politics, that vote is binding on the business, that the business can no longer simply ignore it, that the business has to live within it. So this is one way that we can address the fact that the campaign finance reform provision of this legislation doesn't go anywhere. Now, like most progressives and liberals, I was very frustrated when I read about Joe Manchin's opposition to the For the People Act. But this is an exciting opportunity here. And my suggestion today is the type of thing that frequently gets me in trouble with other progressives who sometimes call me a moderate or someone who's willing to give up. It's not that I'm willing to give up, it's that I'm willing to take some progress over no progress. And the truth is, given the way Republicans are acting in the state legislatures in state after state right now, no progress doesn't simply mean no progress. No progress actually means negative progress, because the Republicans are actually passing legislation that would make it harder to vote and would undo many of the rights that we are hoping to gain for people of color, for women, for members of the LGBTQIA community. Purity at this point is not something that we should stand on. We should not simply take the attitude of, hey, it's the For the People Act or nothing. What we need to do is take what we can get. And according to Joe Manchin right now, this is what we can get, and we should take it, because most of these provisions are great steps in the right direction. This would be probably the most sweeping piece of political reform legislation passed since the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s. And it would basically undo what many of the state legislatures are trying to do across the country. We might all be frustrated right now with Joe Manchin's commitment to bipartisanship, but given what he has signaled he's willing to support here, this is something that we can all get behind. So with that said, I'm going to urge you to contact your member of Congress and suggest that they support the Manchin proposal for a bipartisan deal that would address voting rights issues, number one. Number two, that they should support the Andy Levin legislation to allow the SEC to require greater disclosure by publicly traded corporations of their political spending. And number three, that they actually expand that legislation to include a requirement simply that publicly traded businesses disclose their political activity, and to empower shareholder votes so that when they vote to stop political activity or to at least require its disclosure, as they have now repeatedly, that those votes would not just be advisory, but that those votes would be binding on the board and binding on the managers of the business. If you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to see your comments below. If you liked this video, if you could like it, maybe subscribe and check that little bell that will notify you when I post a new video. And I will see you in the next video, and let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.